So today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the newest releases from Oris, their Diver 65, part of their Cotton Candy series, a nice little mid-sized diver, so let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of 38 millimeters, lug to lug of 45.8, height of 13, and a lug width of 19 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for the watch, we're going to have the Oris caliber 733 beating away in here through a closed case back. It's just a rebranded SW200 movement from Sellita. A pretty domed sapphire crystal here, which is nice to see that it's actually done in sapphire. That is actually domed on the outside and the inside according to Oris, and there is an inner AR coating applied. We also have 100 meters of stated water resistance with a screw down crown and BGW9 for all the hands and indices on the dial. And last but not least, the watch retails directly from Oris on the bracelet for $2,500. So starting off with the dial of this watch, and I think it's probably the best part about it, it's a very vibrant, colorful, fun, almost deep lacquered color to it. It's in this baby blue, sky blue type color. This is part of what they call their Cotton Candy series, which was originally released in bronze, whereas now we have it in stainless steel. I do think it was an interesting choice that they changed the colors moving from the bronze to the steel. Not all the colors are the same saturation or same relative tone. But yeah, I mean, I guess more variation in the collection. So looking at the dial a little bit more generally, we have circular pips for most of the markers at 3, 6. We have the rectangular ones. At 12, we have this more trapezoidal shape. Nothing at the 6 o'clock because we have just a date window there. Nice symmetry happening because of that. And you can tell, like, if I move the watch around, there's definitely kind of distortions that happen from that sapphire crystal, which is interesting because at least to me, at some angles, this Oris 12 o'clock looks a little bit too low on the dial in comparison to everything else. It almost seems like it's supposed to be a little higher up. But when you kind of like look at it without the reflection, you can see it is pretty much almost towards the top. But with the reflection, the curvature of the crystal, it almost slightly pushes it down onto the dial. It makes it seem a little bit at odds with the rest of the symmetry in a sense. So I don't know if that's something they can change, slightly move that marker up, or if it's something only I notice and care about, but it's there. I do like how monochrome this watch is. We have this beautiful blue tone to the dial, and then we just have basically white and silver everywhere else. White for the text here, white for the date window, white for the seconds track, and then silver applied indices everywhere else. We do have this somewhat, I think they call it pencil style handset here for the Oris. A little tip at the end. I guess it's a little bit for just delineation between the two hands. A little bit of an odd shape. I'll leave it up to your imagination what I think it kind of looks like. But digressing from that, I do like that they kept the text very minimal on this watch. It's literally just Oris at the 12, water resistance, and 100 meters here at the 6, and then Swiss made near the date window. Really clean. I like that they kept the text at 6 pretty small and minimal, and Oris is the largest amount of text on the dial because, of course, that's the brand. It's bolder, it's bigger, and I think it looks pretty nice, pretty cohesive. So yeah, overall, beautiful tone to the dial. The indices play with the light fairly well. I like the stark whiteness of all the Lume signature. It really blends in with the watch, makes it feel more fun, makes it feel more summery, rather than introducing any weird green colors with like a super luminova or something like that. So Oris did a good job on the dial for sure. Taking a look at the watch in some natural light, here in the more shaded light, you can see how beautiful just kind of all the brushing, all the finishing looks. The dial itself also goes this very deeper, darker, more saturated blue. The indices pop a little bit, but not too much. The bezel actually does take a lot of kind of light play to it, which is nice to see. So overall, really good in natural light, and I can't complain. Looking in more direct light, you can see the color saturation doesn't really deteriorate. It's still very bright, still very bubbly, but you do get this little bit of an odd crystal flare that happens because of that domed crystal. And to me, it takes away from the wearing experience a little bit. It hinders the dial, and the dial is very beautiful, so you'd want to be able to see it. Going into the shaded light, it goes away completely, which is nice, but it sucks that it's there. Taking a little closer look at the dial here, you can see it is done pretty well. It is pretty much like a lacquered finished dial, this kind of like soft painted feel look to the actual base surface. You can see the text is done really well, a nice three-dimensionality to it, really thick printing on that. Similarly for the text down here at 6 o'clock, that same thick printing, but just done in a little bit of a smaller font. I love that way the like date window curves in because of that lacquered feel to the dial, that lacquer finish, and it just looks pretty premium. You can tell more as I'm zooming around here on the edge how the dial can get distorted a little bit depending on the angle. And if I maybe move it up to 12 o'clock, we can kind of see how it can just seem further away, at least in my opinion, because if you go to this like off angle, you can see it's pretty close to that 12, but as soon as I start moving it down, it literally fades away. You can see right there, it kind of shrinks the edge of the seconds track and makes it feel like there's more of a gap in between the 12 o'clock marker and that seconds track. So it's one of those really weird things where I feel like they maybe should move that marker up just slightly just to compensate for that domage of the crystal. The markers themselves seem pretty well done. There aren't any huge blemishes. There's maybe a little bit of a scratch there on that marker. The hands themselves are fairly clean, a little bit of speck there. I really like the shape of the hands because they have this rounded, kind of gentle parabolic shape to them. And it's nice because it's not the same as a purely flat hand. It has a little bit more light play and light curvature to it because of that. It just adds a little bit more visual interest, and I really enjoy that. Something I also really like is how well they did the Lume infill. It feels very powdery, feels really compact. There isn't any really big splotches or anything missing. It's hard to get a true angle on it. It seems like the Lume infill is either almost perfectly flush or very slightly above the marker, so it adds a little bit of depth. Which is just really nice to see. The Lume obviously looks very much more infilled deeper into the handset than it does into the markers here, but I don't think it contrasts too much, and it probably allows them to put a little bit more Lume on the hands as well. So overall, really clean dial from Oris. I didn't really find any huge glaring QC issues, and it's nice to see. So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is a really nice aspect, not only because it is one of those skin diver cases which only has 100 meters of water resistance, so it leads to a relatively slim profile overall, but this is now a 38 millimeter diver, which is now a mid-sized diver, and we don't have many of those necessarily, and it's nice to see the line growing. This is very much, I guess, positioned to be a Black Bay 58 alternative, and this comes in cheaper than that. I think by over $1,000, if I believe correctly, if I remember the pricing of that. So this definitely presents some good value from a well-built watch, especially if you want that vintage style dive watch look that typically wears a little bit better on wrist, maybe in a more modern colorway that's not black or the more serious blue that Tudor has. Taking a look at the case more generally, we do have this very flat, not quite perfectly circular case. Because the lugs are very integrated in, it gives us almost pseudo cushion style case, but more of a refined cushion, I guess you can say. We do have vertical brushing on the entire top of the case that moves in perfectly with the bracelet, feels very cohesive. High polish on the case sides, no chamfers at all. It makes it feel a little bit more tooly, a little bit more of a sports watch. We do have a high polish to the bezel though, which is interesting. High polish on the outside edge as well. And then high polish on all these, 5, 10, 15, 20 minute marker intervals. What's really cool about the bezel too is you have a lot of depth to it. You have the base silver stainless steel insert, then you have the more raised three-dimensional aspects of those every 5-minute marks, and then you actually have the other minutes engraved into the bezel. So there is a lot of beautiful depth. There's actually a lot of light play that comes from that bezel itself. The silverish gray color really complements and contrasts against the blue nicely. And it's just the thing we don't see a lot in modern watches. Usually people go with aluminum, people go with ceramic. So stainless steel is a little bit rarer, and I do think it's just a really nice look to the watch. Speaking of the bezel, it does have a pretty good action. At times it can be a little bit slippery though, but once you get it going, it's not too hard to move. There isn't really any back play, and there's a little bit, just a slight bit of movement in between when you're trying to go to the next setting, but it's nothing major. Does feel fairly good, nice definitive clicky action, pretty loud, but not cheap or whiny in any sense. And it does line up pretty perfectly at the 12, so that's nice as well. The crown is a little bit on the large side, but that's nice because it is easy to grip, easy to unscrew. There's a very smooth feeling to the unscrewing of the crown. The winding itself, not the smoothest. Of course, it's that classic Sellita feel, that bit of resistance, a little bit of graininess, just an odd little whininess at times, but when you pull the crown out, you're actually actuating the hands. It's a little smoother. There's still a little tiny bit of graininess. You can feel as you're moving it around, like you can almost feel the gears crunching in a way. So it is what it is. But screwing in the crown, super buttery smooth as well. So relatively good crown action. It's just the movement that maybe lets it down a little bit. I'm sure if they did a 5-day version, the new Oris 5-day caliber in this watch, it would feel a little bit better. But but up the price point by about double, so I'm fine with how it is. Moving on to the bracelet for a second, we have this very vintage styled faux rivet, major taper from 19 to 14 millimeters style bracelet, and it's an interesting one. It's the one that Oris uses on these Diver 65s. Of course, it is inspired by a 1965 Oris diver, hence the name. So it's nice that they're keeping that heritage, they're keeping that design language alive. And to be fair, I don't think it looks bad in the modern world. I mean, I could have done without the faux rivets, but for some reason, I feel like the faux rivets don't pop out insanely. They're not super large, so on wrist, I don't notice them that much. So it's kind of like a give or take. I don't mind that they're there, but I wouldn't mind them not being there either. Looking on the clasp, we have a nice little fold over, push button deployant. It is a pretty thin clasp, so it's something that feels very different. It feels a little bit more delicate than most dive watches, almost dressy in a sense. But because this is a skin diver, you have this thinner profile, so this can be worn in scenarios I feel like typical dive watches don't do as well. Like if you have a big chunky diver and you're trying to wear it business casual with like a polo or a button-up shirt, this would work better, not only because of the fun color, but because of how slim and thin it wears. So just something to keep in mind. We do have only push pin links with a collar system. So I would have liked to see screws at this price point. Maybe the original used push pins, I don't know, but let's modernize it a little bit, why don't we? We do have 5 little points of micro adjust in this relatively slim clasp, so that's really nice to see. What is also nice is, although you can't really see it in the bracelet at the moment, Oris does include full links and kind of like 3/4, maybe half link. So like this is pretty much the size of the full link. This is the size of the smaller link. So having 2 of those smaller links and 5 holes of this micro adjust, you can probably get a pretty good fit. And even for me, this setting without even any micro adjust pretty much used at all, fits me pretty perfectly. Really quickly before moving on to like how it wears, you can just see how thin they've made that mid case. The case back takes up a major proportion of the watch. And because that ends up sitting pretty much into the wrist, pretty flush, you get a really thin, just visual presence on the wrist. So it's a very pleasurable thing to wear, and it feels comfortable and it looks nice on the wrist. Touching on the case back, just solid, nothing crazy. I'm assuming the movement really isn't finished to any standard that's crazy looking. It's just kind of a standard Solita movement. So they just went with the classic closed case back with some info on it. So moving on to how this watch wears. Earlier I was wearing my Nomos Club 36 here. And there we have the Oris sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist. And I think you can see it fits pretty much perfectly. It's not really long lug to lug. It's not sitting up high off the wrist by any means. You have a lot of that case back sitting into the wrist. You have the crystal rising above. So really that 13 millimeter height probably ends up feeling like closer to 10, maybe even 9 millimeters. It is a really nice, comfortable watch on wrist. There aren't any sharp edges. The bracelet isn't sharp at all. The taper is comfortable. It doesn't feel too dainty. It doesn't feel like a toy by any means on the wrist. So it is a really nice wearing watch, and I just love that pop of color. You have that all stainless steel, all gray, all silver appearance to the watch, and then you suddenly get to the dial and boom, pop of color. I think this effect is almost increased by having the steel bezel, because there is literally no other color other than that vibrant color of the dial. So it's, I think, a really good execution. Again, looking at the watch from the side view, you can see just how that case back sits perfectly into the wrist. I think Oris just did a really good job on this case. I should maybe thank the Oris design team of 1965, because, you know, they did it right. And good job to modern Oris for not taking too many liberties with the design and making it still wear well, look good on wrist, and feel comfortable. One thing I will note, especially after wearing the watch for a bit, is this link style definitely does feel vintage. It looks a little bit older, just because you have the mid link, which is almost even slightly bigger than the 2 flanking links. So it's a little bit of an interesting look, something you don't really see too often, something I can't even recall on any modern day watch. So it's a different wearing experience, a different visual look than maybe you're used to. And again, it does feel very vintage, and of course that's what they're going for. So if you don't like that, you probably won't like the watch, but if you do, it's a really cool aspect to it. And then moving the watch up a little bit, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist there, and it still looks perfectly fine. Still have more than enough room on each side. You can wear this on 5.5-inch wrist, no problem. Probably even close to a 5-inch wrist, and you'll still have a lot of room to wear this size. So moving on to some other straps, and maybe starting off with what would be the most controversial, a diver on leather. This is a really beautiful strap from Vario, this kind of distressed leather grain, super comfortable, just enough padding but not too much, good thickness to the strap, complements the watch color tone I think really well. And when you take that watch off of that older style, vintage style bracelet, it does, in my opinion, modernize the watch just a little bit. It makes it feel a little bit more fresh, a little bit more fun, but because of that steel bezel, because of the K-shape, because of the dial layout, you still do get a little bit of that vintage flair. It wears supremely well, still very thin. I think it's one of those things where because this is one of those thinner divers, one of those almost quote-unquote duress divers, you can put this on leather and it doesn't look bad. Moving on to some other more sporty straps, we have this nice, I think it's called Matte Supreme NATO from Crown & Buckle. Really cool color tone to this, a nice little grain that adds a little bit of texture to the otherwise textureless watch. And again, you just introduce some other colors that match and complement that blue, but don't kind of overshadow it. Wears great on a NATO because, again, it's not thick, so you're not really adding much height to it at all. And even if you did add a little bit of height to it, it can survive. It's a very thin watch. So really comfortable combo, really good NATO, and yeah, looks good on the watch, I think. Next, we have this Crown & Buckle Chevron Strap, and I believe it's called Harris Tweed. And this, I think, complements perfectly. Just a little bit texture, a little bit more subtle than the previous strap. Again, the lacquered finish is very smooth, very textureless, right? So adding just a little bit of fun to the watch, a little bit of visual interest is welcome. Looks great in my opinion, adding more shades of gray to this very grayed out watch, but giving it a different shade, a little bit of a darker to help contrast and kind of work and add just a small third color. It actually even plays really well off the kind of polished accents of the 5, 10, 15-minute markers because they do go this darker anthracite gray at certain angles. So this, I think, works perfectly with the watch. And last but not least, the classic white Archer silicone strap, of course, plays off the white tones of the Lume perfectly. Very summery, very fun combo. Amazingly comfortable on the wrist. Really just helps the watch be even that bit more fun. And of course, if you don't want to take your bracelet into the water and worry about corrosion or anything like that, put it on this rubber strap and you're good to go. So this is, I think, a combo that almost needs to go with this watch because why not? You're working perfectly off all the tones that already exist and making what is supposed to already be a fun watch even more fun. So taking a look at the Lume of the watch, I think it's a little disappointing. The hands are the brightest part. The markers themselves are a little bit duller. At least you can see everything because even the hands, the seconds hand and the 12 o'clock marker are loomed, but they do need to do a little bit of a better job. Re-looming and comparing it to the Timex here, you can see again, it's not that bright. It does actually die off fairly quickly after having some extra lume to it, so this is one area Oris needs to do a little bit better. So pros and cons of this Diver 65, and starting off, one of the biggest pros for me is just going to be the size of it. It is a mid-sized diver. It's nice to see a smaller diver come around thanks to basically add to or challenge the Black Bay 58 range, and it's something that I think needs to be more prevalent. It's nice to have some smaller divers for smaller wristed people. And thankfully it is both a smaller diver and it actually fits comfortably. Not only is it relatively thin, they didn't make it small but stout and stubby and weird in proportion. It's also just very comfortable to wear in terms of the bracelet and case feel. It's very silky, very smooth, and they just did a really good job on the wearing experience overall. Another big pro for the watch, in my opinion, is just the colors. I think the watch industry needs more color. It's kind of getting stale seeing black, white, and blue dials. Even though this is a blue dial, it's a very interesting shade of blue. It's not the classic navy, boring, commonplace blue in a sense. It's something a little bit more fun, a little bit brighter, and something that just adds some life into a watch box. And I think that's something that people who are looking at this watch are probably looking for. I think Oris is one of those brands you typically find after having a couple watches, so it's nice to add some variety into the watch box with a very interesting color like this. Another big pro for the watch, in my opinion, is the dial quality is very high. Not only is the depth of the color very nice, this kind of lacquered feel to the dial. The indices are finished very well. The printing on the dial is done nice and three-dimensionally. It's all stark, crisp, and clean. And there isn't really any QC issues that I could find with it for the most part. They were all very small, very minor. So Oris did a really good job on just the base dial and how it presents in person. My last pro for this watch is I do think it's just relatively good value. It comes in at $25.50, which there isn't a lot directly below it or directly above it that I think competes with it. I think there should be some more things in the $1,000 to $2,000 range to kind of fill that gap, but you are competing with things like the Black Bay 58, which is $39.50 or so, which is over $1,000 more. That has that same vintage aesthetic to it, has that same similar footprint to it. Maybe comparing it to like the Doxa Sub 200, which in comparison, that's probably a little bit better value at just under $1,000. But having owned them both, I do think the case shape of the Oris is better. There's definitely give or takes either way, but I do think relatively, or what you're getting for the quality for the package, it's not overvalued. Now moving on to cons, and one of the biggest cons for me personally was the fact that the crystal can play with the reflections onto the dial, and it can just look a little odd at times, especially when you get into direct sunlight. You get this kind of gentle U shape that appears around the dial, and it's one of those things where it ruins the experience a little bit for me. It casts this shadow, this little kind of mark onto the dial, I guess you can say, that just detracts from the dial beauty in my opinion. In direct sunlight, this watch looks amazing because that color is so saturated, so deep, that it comes through really well even in bright light. But it's hindered a little bit by this crystal flare, crystal appearance. I don't know if that's a fact of like they need maybe slightly better AR, or they just have to slightly de-dome or just flatten the crystal. Either way, whatever step they have to take, I think they should take it, because in my opinion, it ruins the wearing experience a little bit. And to be fair, I really don't have many cons with this watch. My only other one is the fact that the lume is just terrible. They need much more application of it. The hands are the brightest part, whereas you would expect them not to be. It's just an odd thing. I think, especially at this price point, you should be doing a little bit better on the lume, especially if you are a dive watch. So that's just something they do need to improve on for sure. So final thoughts on this watch, and I like it a lot more than I thought I would. It's one of those things where I've always enjoyed the aesthetic of the Diver 65. I like that vintage style diver, I like the thinness of it, I like the case shape, but I never loved the sizing that they always offered. I think it originally released in 42 and 40, or maybe it was just 42, I'm not quite sure, but neither of those sizes fit me perfectly, or I just didn't like how they sat and looked on my wrist. Whereas with this 38, it looks amazing. I believe this is one of the first versions that's been like more affordable in a sense. Previously you had one with the 5-day movement in it, you've had the bronze versions, but now we have the most standard looking and attainable version of this watch. And I do think it's a really nice package. When I saw the release online, I figured I probably will like these in person. I do just enjoy saturated dials. I do enjoy more like lacquered colors and more fun colors as well. And I do think it's needed in the watch industry. The only thing I don't enjoy about this series personally is the fact that they changed the colors so much, going from the cotton candy bronze series to this one. I don't know if the inspiration is to differentiate the two, but for example, I really loved the tone of pink they went for on the bronze, but they changed it to more like of a true salmon fish colored dial on the stainless steel version. And I just don't like that color as much. I don't like that tone as much personally. So had they kept all the colors from the original, I would have gone for the pink one. But in person, I think as a dive watch, as a fun watch, the blue popped the most and made the most sense to me. I think the green was a close second, but the Nomos that I showed earlier in the video actually is a very similar color tone to the green, and I already have the Nomos. So yeah, it's a fantastic watch. I think it's a good release from Oris, and if you're looking for a smaller diver and a little bit of fun, it's hard not to recommend it. I think undoubtedly this watch has more pros than it does cons, but let me know what you think down below. Let me know if I'm right or wrong. Anyway, thank you as always for watching this video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.